Welcome dear student, today I am going to talk about the anatomy of the orbital cavity. Here you can see this hole is called the orbital cavity. It is pyramidal shape which his base is face anteriorly while the apex is face posteriorly. So there are four walls of the orbital cavity. One is the superior wall, the inferior wall which is also called the floor, and the superior wall is called the roof, the lateral wall and the medial wall, and there are four border or margin. One is the superior margin, the inferior margin, the lateral margin, and the medial margin. So the bones that are forming the wall of the orbital cavity, here I will discuss about these bones. So the superior wall or roof of the orbital cavity is formed by the orbital plate of the frontal bone. Here you can see this is called orbital plate of the frontal bone, and you can see from the interior of the skull. Here you can see this is called orbital plate of the frontal bone, which form the roof of the orbital cavity. And the laser wing of the sphenoid bone is also forming the roof of the frontal roof of the orbital cavity. The orbital cavity actually separate the orbital cavity from the anterior cranial fossa. So the floor of the orbital cavity is formed by the orbital surface of the maxilla. This is the maxilla, and the surface maxilla, here you can see this is the orbital surface of the maxilla, and this is the orbital surface of the zygomatic bone. These two bones are forming the floor of the orbit. And the lateral wall is actually, here you can see it is formed by the frontal process of the zygomatic bone, and more posteriorly by the orbital plate of the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. The medial wall is formed by the frontal process of the maxilla, the lacrimal bone, and the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone. Here you can see from the interior of the skull. This is the ethmoidal bone, and there are plates which actually forming the medial wall of the orbital cavity. So the margin, there is here you can see there is a superior margin, the inferior margin, the medial margin, and the lateral margin. The superior margin is formed by the frontal bone. Here you can see, and it has supraorbital foramen. Here you can see this is called supraorbital foramen. And the inferior margin is formed by the zygomatic bone and the maxilla bone, and it has infraorbital foramen. And the lateral margin of the orbital cavity is formed by the frontal process of the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process of the frontal bone. Here you can see this is the zygomatic process of the frontal bone, and this is the frontal process of the and the medial margin of the orbital cavity is formed by the frontal process of the maxilla. Here you can see this is called the frontal process of the maxilla and the maxillary process of the frontal bone. This is the maxillary process of the frontal bone. So now the foramens that are formed, you can see there are two foramen. One is the supraorbital foramen and the infraorbital foramen. There are two fissures. One is the superior orbital fissure. Here you can see from the interior of the skull, this is the superior orbital fissure. In the inferior orbital fissure, here you can see this is the inferior orbital fissure. And there is only one canal which leads to the orbital cavity. Here you can see this is called the optic canal, which is forming the laser wing of the sphenoid bone. The floor of the orbital cavity separate the maxillary sinus from the orbital cavity. So this was all about the orbital cavity.